Hey, let's talk about grief. Let's talk about why I titled this That They Don't Care About Your Grief. And also, while part of my title is Three Things I've Learned After the Death of My Brother. I want to talk about both of these because I think it can be helpful to anyone who is grieving and feeling a lot of emotions around the grieving process. Maybe it's taking you time to grieve and you're wondering why and you're feeling bad about this or guilt or feeling like you should be further along. Maybe you feel like there are people who don't understand. Maybe you recognize that you are trying to grieve and where you're at is not allowing you to grieve properly. Let's just talk about it because I learned so much through the death of my brother Brent. I'm going to more than likely talk about him in the present tense because I have a feeling and a knowing that my brother is still with me. And I really believe in the African proverb that talks about your loved one is not dead until you stop talking about them. So I bring up his name often because he still lives, and that is definitely how he still lives in my heart. So I lost my brother Brent in 2022. The end of 2022, my brother passed from complications and side effects of his cancer treatment. He was 51 years old, and it was really a trying time. I had never lost a sibling before. I had three siblings, and it was probably one of my larger fears, the idea of losing a sibling. We all know that every death is different. So this was definitely an experience that was very different from any other death I experienced. And I'm going to say probably one of the closest relationships I had in terms of someone I had lost. I think for me and in my life experience, my relationship with my siblings, they've been close relationships. They're like friends. Part of that relationship evolves around a level of friendship. So, Brent was a friend, even though he was a big brother and a protector more. It was a lot of emotion around losing him. And so, in this process of grief, I've learned three things that I do want to share with you. And I share these because when I do say that they don't care about your grieving, I live in America where the system is based on capitalism, and that's just what it is. And whenever you are in a place where capitalism is at the forefront, that means that making money is at the forefront. It is not about people initially. And so when you're in a place where it's not about people initially, a lot of things that could be sacred are put on the back burner, or they're definitely not put at the front. And things become off balance within your own spirit when you're trying to operate in that type of a system. I see death as being part of a sacred process. Coming into life is sacred, and leaving this life is also sacred. And one of the things that happened with me is having a brother who transitions. First of all, my work environment doesn't necessarily honor the death of a sibling in the way that maybe it would honor the death of a child or the death of a parent, even though those are, we still get very limited time constraints in all of these areas. But the death of a brother, there's some acknowledgement, but the acknowledgement for me was having a few days off work, maybe a week off work, but then it's really getting back into this life and doing things supposedly the way that you've done them, getting back to that routine. And this society it creates that. This society creates that type of experience. And so what I learned is that I do not have to be completely on the same page as the society in terms of how I'm going to grieve Brent. I get to make this what works for me in the ways that I'm able to do that. So that meant, and that looks like me not feeling like I need to be over him and his death in some time frame that the society would say that it should be over. when I'm working in psychiatry, because I am a psychiatric nurse practitioner. If I didn't mention that, hello, my name is Crystal Turner. I am a psychiatric nurse practitioner who has gone holistic, meaning that I have gone beyond the structure of the traditional medicine where I live to understand more about people and my experiences and people experiences to create a holistic approach to healing. And doing that and looking at the grieving process in psychiatry, it's about a 4-month period that we give for the idea of it being normal to feel these emotions of sadness and grief. And then after that, if you're having trouble functioning and not able to function for work, not able to function in your day-to-day life, then we start looking at prescribing medication. And I think that speaks to the society that we're in, that this idea that after 4 months you should be able to function in the regular ways to be able to get up and do the things. And I know that is just one way of seeing things. I went on this trip to Cartagena, Colombia. This was maybe a year before Brent passed away. I went to Cartagena, Colombia, and when I was there, I love to get immersed in the culture, and I visited a group of people called Palenque people. Palenque people were people of African descent who had been freed from slavery, and in their community, they kept their educational traditions, but they also kept their spiritual traditions. One of their traditions evolved around death and how mothers mourned the death of their children. And they were allowed through ceremonies of the community had that brought about a lot of support to them. They came together, they celebrated the person's life, but they also embraced the mothers and allowed them to grieve deeply. They were not shamed for their grieving. They were not made to feel like they need to rush through their grieving. And even after these ceremonies happened in their communities, the community still gave strong support around them well after that ceremony happened. And that really spoke to me how beautiful that was, that there are places where you can grieve and it is not a time constraint on your grief, or it's definitely not where you're feeling rushed and feeling shame around something so sacred as someone's life leaving that you've loved, who's been a part of your life. And so that allowed me to say, well, I might not live in a society that goes by this model, but I can definitely hold that in my heart. And you can too. You can hold in your heart that your grieving process does not have to look like the way a society says it needs to look. You can recognize that there is a broader way that things are done beyond the society that you're in. And if that resonates with you, explore that. And that's what helps. One of the things that really helps me in the grieving and understand grief is that I don't have to go by the society that I'm in. There may be some things that I don't have complete control over if I have to go back to work, but this idea of how my grieving should look as a whole and people coming to me telling me about how I should grieve, I don't have to go by that. I'm able to recognize what works for me, what makes me be able to function better is to also be able to express those emotions of love. I look at that grieving as an expression of love for someone who's meant so much. The second thing that I've learned about grieving from losing my brother Brent is that there is a broader way that I can look at the death and dying process and my ideas of what goes beyond death. I have grown up in a Christian dominant society, and being in this society, basically, I've taken on a lot of the ways that the society functions. You kind of you're in a culture, so you kind of take on some of the things almost in this natural way because it's all around you. Subconsciously, it's fed to you, all the things. And one of the things that, I really came to live and believe at one point is that, you die, you live, you die, you go to heaven or you go to hell. And there is no more connecting with that person once they're gone, not while you're still living. And I've learned that that is not helping my process of grieving. I had a mentor who gave me a book called Journey of Souls that was this neuropsychiatrist who had patients that he saw and did hypnotherapy on. And what he started to find is that when he would do this hypnotherapy, a large portion of his cases would start talking to him from lives in between lives, or, you know, their lives before the current life that they were in. And it was so fascinating because it helps me to be able to have a broader concept of death and just some more depth to this death and this life thing. And this book, it had a lot of case studies that showed this consistency that he was experiencing when he did hypnotherapy with his patients. So that was something that really helps me to be able to say, I'm going to give myself permission to be able to be more expansive in how I look at this process of transitioning. And I don't need anyone else's permission to do that. I don't have to go by someone else's religious protocols. I don't have to be in a place of shame because I have a way of seeing the death of a loved one and what that might be beyond what I've learned. And that's helped me to have being more open to the idea that I could connect with Brent, even though he's not here physically, that his energy is still existing. And there are ways that I can still connect with that energy. And there are people who have told me when I've said this that, basically that's a demonic thought. But I'm not here to live a life that just comes from someone else's perspective. That's not something that resonates with me. And if it isn't something that resonates with me, and if that's not something that resonates with you, what I've learned through this grieving process is that I am allowed, if I give myself permission, and you're allowed, if you give yourself permission, to be able to have an expanded idea of what happens after death and during the death process, because that has given me a lot of peace and a lot of curiosity and openness to the ideas of my brother may even be living in a more powerful way than what he did in this physical experience. The third thing that I've learned about the grieving process as my brother Brent has transitioned is that everyone's grieving process is different. And while I know that we hear that, but I've learned that through my experience because I am just one person who had a relationship with my brother. My niece, his daughter, had a relationship. My mom had a relationship. My two other siblings had a relationship with him. And there were friends who had a relationship with him. And the beautiful thing is that we all had different relationships. We related to him different. When we allow ourselves to talk about him and say his name, different things come up. I learned new things about Brent even still today through other people who've had experienced his life. And when I'm able to experience him this way in a new way, because it's through someone else's lens and perspective, it is refreshing. It is like I'm still experiencing him with things I didn't even know about him after he's gone. I've had loved ones share pictures of him, pictures I've never seen of him. And that feels so good when I come across some new picture that's shared with me of him that I never knew about. And then, especially if there's some story behind the picture, I'm like literally still experiencing him, new things about him. And I had to allow myself to be open to, first of all, recognizing that someone else's grieving and their way of connecting and their experience with him is different from mine. It's allowed me to be open to what their experiences have been and to be able to see things with refreshed eyes and see my brother even with renewed eyes based on parts of him I didn't know and different scenarios that he's lived that I didn't know about. These are things that make my heart smile. They make me smile. And it actually helps me be more connected to other people that Brent loved. And I think that's been a really healing factor for me. There are some friends that my brother has that we've gotten closer through his transition, because initially it comforted us, each other, to be in connection with someone that he was close to. And those relationships have still continued to live on. And I think that that's a part of, for me, a beauty that has come even in something that's been painful. And it's through the connection that we had. The common factor has been Brent. That's been the common factor. This is a process. This grieving is a process. And it may be a lifelong process. I have had patients who, when I used to work in hospice, that when they were in the death and dying process, they would start talking to people who had transitioned. So it could have been 50 years ago that person transitioned. And now that they're transitioning, somehow they're not talking as much to the people around them in this physical life, but they're connecting or talking more to people who had transitioned. And so, sometimes it's a forever process grieving, because 50 years could be in between the time that someone you loved left and now that you're on this brink of transitioning. Now suddenly this person comes back up for you. This is who you're talking to and communicating with. It's literally a part of the death and dying process, so much so that many hospice books that teach the family about death and dying, it mentions how people tend to start talking to people who have transitioned. And you can relate to that, how it is that you relate to it. But the fact is, I worked in hospice many years, and I saw it in just about every patient I had who transitioned. And so I say all of that to say that the grieving process could be your whole life, because even if there's 50 years in between the time that person passed and the time that you pass, that person may still come up because there was a connection there that was important. And I really do see a beauty in that. I really do see a beauty in that. And I hope that this video was helpful for you if you are dealing with grief. That there is an expanded way that we can see things and deal with things. No, I am not saying that it takes all the pain away, but pain is a part of love. Pain is a part of losing someone in a physical sense, and missing their presence. It's a part of that, and I recognize that. But in the process of how I've been able to grieve, it's also allowed me to have beautiful moments, really loving moments that help me to continue in this life in a way that, my heart can still smile, and that's what I want for you, is that while there can be a lot of pain in someone that you care so deeply for, that there can also be a lot of love that can still be expressed and help you to have a heart that can smile even in the midst of things, even in missing them, because I understand missing them. If this video spoke to you, I would like for you to speak to me by giving me a subscribe to my channel, and to also like this video. And also to put a heart in the comment section if you resonated with this. And I will see you in my next video. Bye.